and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to The Future is Female. This is the show where we find the extraordinary in every woman. I'm delighted to introduce my guest today, Elizabeth Cardosa, a cultural heritage and conservation consultant. Elizabeth is a registered conservator with Jabatan Warisan Negara and has been involved in several conservation and restoration projects, including on Stadium Merdeka, which won the UNESCO Asia Pacific Heritage Award of Excellence in 2010, as well as the conservation of Masjid DiRaja Sultan Sulaiman in Klang, which won the 2019 PAM Gold Medal Award. So I'm delighted to have you on the show. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm very curious to know how you got into this journey of cultural and heritage preservation. Have you always loved this line of work? What led you to be in this field?
Almost by accident, I would say. I've always worked in the cultural field.
Okay, yes.
And so, you know, heritage was kind of like one of the things that came along the way. And obviously, when you work in culture, you come across things which are old and things which are new. And, you know, so it was, I was kind of looking for a bit of a change in the late 90s. And at that time, I was working specifically in the cultural arena, looking at cultural exchange activities with the British Council. And that was many, many moons ago when I think the organization was quite a different animal that it is today. And then this opportunity came up and you know, someone called and said, would you like to be the executive director of Badan Warisan Malaysia? And so, and it was like, okay, let's do an interview. And it was an interesting interview where we talked about everything but the job.
I love interviews like that.
Yeah, no, it was really, really interesting. And I think what then transpired was, you know, I decided to move into this field and very quickly discovered that actually the issues were exactly the same as I'd been dealing all the time, except the vocabulary was different.
What kind of issues?
Yeah, you know, to do with funding, to do with capacity building, to do with story, you know, the manner in which information is passed. How do you deal with public awareness raising? Just about everything that you had to deal with in culture, I had to deal with in this arena as well. Okay. But I just had to learn new vocabulary to do with the built environment. But one of the things that Badan Warisan was at that time was they were very specifically involved in the built environment. And I was told quite determinedly that I should not introduce too much culture and performing arts into it or other forms of culture, you know, remain within, you know, the built heritage. And so I promptly did.
The opposite of what you
absolutely.
said. So maybe you can help set the scene for me. Maybe the context is important as well. When we talk about preservation of heritage, what does that entail? From your perspective, walk me through what that means to be in this field.
Well, I think that when you deal with heritage, a lot of people sort of deal with two sides to it. They say there is the tangible and the intangible, and that's what, you know, so tangible is anything you can see, you can feel, you can experience directly, you know, it's something you can touch. And the intangible is something which you can't see, but it's there. And I think that when I first started working in heritage, it was very focused on tangible, you know, the buildings, the places, and really not on the intangible, which really underpins.
What are the intangibles?
So you have your setting within which you have the people that created this. So when you look at a building, the building is not seen in isolation. It is, you know, who built it, why was it built, why is it there, what does it look like? All of those things are not things that you can see, no doubt, but who built it? You know, what is it built of? What is the technology that went behind the building, you know, or into it? All of those are not things that are tangible in that sense. You know, technology is there, but how do you understand technology when you don't really see it? You see the structure, but you don't know what went into creating the structure.
Is it the story behind
and
the
then
tangible?
It's also the story, it's also what underpins it, it's also what carries it, it's the sense of what it is. It is almost the soul, or the you know, the crux of it. Because if you don't have that, then you just really just have a photo or a model, or, you know,
or a pile of bricks.
Or a pile of bricks. Yes, exactly, exactly that. It's a pile of bricks.
So how did you bring this perspective into your work? I mean, talk to me about why it's important that we appreciate the story, the intangible behind a beautiful monument, for instance.
Well, if you don't look at what is behind it, I think you don't really, you can appreciate it, but you won't really love it. You won't really care for it, because it isn't something that you associate, you know, more directly, like your own personal experiences with. It tends to be something which is there, you look at it, it's something you appreciate, but you don't sort of see what underlies it. You know, who were the people behind it? You know, what were their stories? Why was it even created in the first place? I think all of those kinds of things are really, really important to understand and to look at, and to sort of once you have that sort of story, the space becomes all that much more meaningful, and the context within which it stands becomes all that much more meaningful.
Okay, give me an example of this in your work. Do you remember any projects that you've worked on where the intangible adds so much meaning to the space?
I think if we go back to when I first started working with Jabatan Warisan, one of the things that Jabatan Warisan was doing at that time was documenting traditional Malay vernacular timber houses, architecture, and in certain places. And one of the places was this kampung around Malacca, I think it was. And 3 months before that, they had been there, and they had been documenting the buildings there, and one of which was a little house which had two older people, more senior people living in it. And it was a very modest place, but it was obviously, it was, you know, well kept, and it was very livable, but it was very simple. It was just a timber building on stilts, and didn't have furniture, and wasn't very, you know, it was very much a traditional, you know, Malay kampung house, and the lifestyle was very much that. Well, 3 months later, after I joined Jabatan Warisan, you know, go back to the same place, and the house is no longer there. And in its place is a rather banal-looking brick structure house, which is on the ground. It's no longer on stilts, and the old people who used to live in them, who lived in that place, were still there, but they were now living in this different house, in this different kind of structure, brick structure, and they were sitting outside. And so then the sort of the question was, you know, like what happened, or why did you, you know, make this decision to demolish that building and then build this new structure? And the old woman said, can I speak Malay? I can.
Yes, of course.
Kalau rumah papan, orang kata kita tak maju. And so this whole idea of what is progress, or what is development, or what is expected, or what, you know, they exchange something which they've been living in for, you know, 50, 60 years, and with something which was possibly less comfortable because it didn't have the natural ventilation that you had, you know, with the timber house. Of course, it had its modern facilities. Of course, it had a modern toilet and a modern kitchen and furniture, but they were sitting outside, and so it's because the inside was darker or less comfortable or whatever.
Right.
And so it sort of struck home, I think, that, you know, we look at some things and we say, well, how do we define development? How do we define progress? How do we define what we want and the kinds of places we want to live in, or the things we want to surround ourselves with? I think that that's kind of where...
Does that give you a sort of existential crisis when you think, as a conservationist, when you think about, you know, balancing this, the way what we value as a society, high rises and built environment that's modern and, you know, metropolitan, versus kalau duduk rumah kampung, siapa kata tak maju, rumah papa kata tak maju. So how do we think about what we treasure and value with our built environment, for instance, and, you know, overlooking some of the more ordinary, the more cultural, the more mundane, if I may use the word.
The more modest, the more
modest.
I think that one of the things for me, really, when you look at it and you think about it, is it isn't whether one is better than the other. It's that one does provide a point within which you can contrast and compare with the other. And then you make your own decision as to what you want. And sure, you know, having high rises and, you know, tall buildings and modern amenities is really important. You know, we shouldn't ignore it. We shouldn't say, you must live in your rumah kampung and you must have an outhouse. You know what I mean?
Modern conveniences.
No modern conveniences, and you can't have, you know, you must cook using that's ridiculous.
Okay.
I mean, that is not something that conservation is about.
Okay.
It is about dealing with the values that these older structures or places or even your cultural practices have in terms of how they stand vis-a-vis your own belief system, your own practices, your own life, and then taking that and moving forward and saying, okay, what is it that I want in terms of what value is it that I can have with it, or what did it bring to me before that, you know, I would want to bring into the future. So it really is, and you will never know it unless it's not there. And so, as I was saying to you the other day, you know, that my hypothesis is basically, my thesis statement.
Thesis statement.
Is that the value of heritage is in its absence, because you will never know what you miss or what is missing unless it's not there. And so I suppose as a practitioner, what I want to see is that we begin to value what we have, no matter how modest. And we can value it for ourselves, we can value it for our family, we can, you know, certainly have national value.
Okay.
But it doesn't diminish the personal value, it doesn't diminish the individual value. It just is, you cannot expect that just because it is something I value, that everybody else
must
has.
value. Okay, how do we think about that from maybe a national standpoint or a country, nation-state standpoint? How do we ensure what we value in terms of heritage, preservation of heritage, is not just the stories of the elites, the stories of the kings and the bangsawans of the country, but also the ordinary men and women who built the nation? How do we make sure
I think that I think that really is something that I see in the last maybe 10, 15 years, and social media has done a lot for that, you know, to help bring these stories forward, to allow for this to be acknowledged as important, even if it isn't important for the nation. It is important, it may be important for the community. These are all points of lessons learned, of previous understanding of where we are and what we want, you know. And it doesn't only have to apply, I think, to the big, the beautiful, and as you said, you know, the heritage of the kings and princes, you know, and the priests and the royals and that, because that, imagine that if everything was a palace, then would we appreciate a palace, you know?
There's no point of comparison.
So you need to have that range, I think, and that's part of the balance. You need to be able to have those perspectives shown, and then you make your own decisions, I mean, you know, as to what you want. But I think that chasing after what somebody else tells you is important, is something that we, I think, have to learn to really be a little bit more conscious of, not to see heritage as either as a stigma, or, which is what it used to be, I think, you know, when I first started in the arena, it was pretty stigmatized.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, old lah, you know. Why do you want bangunan
Why
lama?
save
You know, why
it?
save it? You know,
Right.
it's old. You know, it's like, why don't we have something new? Why don't we? So it's old versus new, and it isn't, because the old can bring value. And it's as if you are, you know, this whole thing about Asian values, right? Teaching your grandmother how to do X, Y, or Z. You know, imagine, you know, asking your grandmother to put on a red miniskirt. I mean, that's just the idea of it.
Some grandmothers might.
Yeah, no, some grandmothers might. Yes, I know that. But, you know, imagine that you generally say, oh, no, this is how you must dress nowadays, you know.
But that's a good point, because what we value changes from generation to generation.
And we have to value that too. We have to value our understanding of it and how it changes, and not say, oh no, we must be stuck, because we shouldn't be stuck. And culture is like that. Culture is ever evolving. It's not.
Well, talk to me about putting on the lens of decolonization. So we value a lot of our colonial heritage, and it's intertwined with our history. But how do we think about how to approach heritage conservation with a decolonized lens?
Yeah, well,
it's a tough one.
It's a tough one because you know, we're quite conflicted very often. You know, what is considered to be great or beautiful or points of interest in terms of buildings anyway, you know, relates back to our colonial past. And I think that it isn't so much that we should dismiss the colonial past. And I'm not saying we should embrace it either, you know, but embrace the fact that it has happened, acknowledge that it has happened. And I think that there has to be a certain amount of veracity and truth in it. One of the things that I'm really keen on is documentation, and looking for old documents, and trying to understand things by looking at the history of a place or at the stories behind them, because they then tell you, you know, what the past was, and then tell you how long ago it happened. And you know, you can kind of almost see that, okay, is this where we're going? We have, I think a lot of people have smattering bits of records, but you know how you just kind of like throw away old letters and throw away old photos and but then there's the opposite, you know, you are a pack rat, you know, keep everything, you know. And so it's what is important, I think, for us to understand is, as individuals, what is important for ourselves, me, my family, me, my community, larger than my family, me, my community, my region, let's say, or my larger community, my state, you know, like in Malaysia, am I from Selangor, am I from Perak?
It makes a difference.
It's a big difference. I mean, people identify that way. And then beyond that, you know, so we all wear many, many different hats. I mean, we are many different things at any one time. So, you know, me, I am Japanese, Chinese, Italian, Eurasian-ish is sort of, born in Malaysia, Selangor, in a tiny little town called Sabak Bernam. It's no longer as tiny, but it used to be. Lived in Kelantan, completely happy there. Lived in Penang, lived in KL. Consider myself very much an urban KL kind of person. Studied abroad, you know, traveled, but spent quite a lot of time traveling within the country because, you know, I felt you want to travel, you can travel. But it's also nice to see what you have. You know, I used to do these road trips. A friend of mine and I used to do these road trips where we would leave our kids, who are quite young, with our husbands, and then say, okay, we're going on a road trip, and look for old mosques to see where they were and what they were. And so where you have a mosque or a temple or a church or a Hindu temple, or you have a community. And if you have a community, you look at what the community, why they were there, what they were doing, and what their relationship, you know, to the area was, and to the state and to the nation, and then you build on that. So it sort of helps you I think, appreciate different, cultural perspectives.
That brings me back to what you were saying about sometimes we appreciate heritage, but we don't love it. And it's the stories behind it that makes us love and relate to and feel strongly about our heritage and our culture. Your point about the value of heritage only being felt when it's in its absence. Talk to me about that. What is lost when we don't... What happens to a community when heritage is lost or erased?
Okay. In the early 2000s, just taking KL as an example, there were three buildings structures that were being talked about in the three sets of buildings. Okay, one was the Pudu Jail. One was Cardosa in Srinagar, and one was what people call the Lekok Door, which is Bok House. Completely different stories behind them, different reasons for them being built, different uses, etc., etc. Now, let's just take Pudu Jail and Cardosa Srinagar. And in those days, it wasn't all about social media or about, radio or television. It was about the print media.
Yes.
Yeah? And there was a lot of, in the business times, for example, in the business pages, there was a lot of talk about, why Cardosa Srinagar was so important and it should be kept. And, at that time it had been converted and used as a hotel, right? And there were sort of different issues and there were complaints, or there were questions about, should you keep it, should you not keep it, whatever. Or it's not well kept. And there was lots of stuff related to that because it was big and beautiful and it had a history that, again, as Malaysians, we're quite conflicted about our colonial past. So it's like,
yes.
Do we want it? Do we not want it? But that aside, yeah. At the same time, there was a lot of discussion about, but not in the newspapers, about Pudu Jail.
Okay.
Pudu Jail had already been vacated. I mean, it was no longer a jail. That moved the jail premises that was being used as. And I think they were planning to demolish it and rebuild what is now BBCC, I think it's called.
Lala Pot.
Yes, yes.
That's right.
And it was like, it was not important because it was a jail, and so it was in the center of town, and you had to get rid of it because it was,
who wants a jail?
Who wants a jail
of town?
Yeah, and jail is a place for incarcerating bad people. Yeah, of course, Pudu Jail has more than that. I mean, it has more history than that, and as a structure, it had more. And imagine that at the time it was built in the late 1890s, mid 1890s, it was KL city centre was, a little bit of a distance, and you had to walk to it, 3 or 4 mile walk, kilometre walk. So it wasn't within the city centre, but the city, of course, had grown and enveloped the jail. And there was no call by the Business Times or the business pages for retaining the structure because of its historical importance to the nation, to the story of Kuala Lumpur, to the story of incarceration, to actually as a building, as a structure, it was really quite interesting as well. But, it's all bad people. Botak Chingman was there. All the bad people were there, right? And so you had that side of it. And so it was just totally ignored. And I was talking to a young person after that, at one time. And he said, the thing is that with Cardosa Srinagar, we never see it because we travel on the bus. And it is not part of our visual landscape. Whereas, because we travel on the bus and on the on the LRT or we pass this, and so every day, and so it's the big people, the business people, the people who go by in their cars whizzing past very quickly, who don't actually see, but it is part of our
I remember the walls.
Cultural landscape. Yes, absolutely. And it was, what is it that makes that important to the city of Kuala Lumpur. And I mean, I will say this, my daughter was very young before it was demolished. And she saw the walls for the first time. She must have been 6 or something like that. And she asked me about it, so I explained to her about the walls and the story behind the walls and who painted it, etc., as I tend to do. And she said, and then I told her it was going to be demolished, and she completely freaked out. I mean, she had absolutely no idea, but she was totally caught up in the idea that there was this prisoner who got this paint and who painted this incredible landscape, which was it was a beach, natural landscape, which is the total opposite of what was happening inside. And she said to me, Mummy, you will save it. I was working with Jabatan Warisan, you will save it, won't you? And I said, I don't think we can. You know, we've done a lot of advocacy to try. And when it was demolished, finally, she just turned to me and she said, you failed. I mean, it was like, okay, honey, you know, not my fault, but okay, I get it. You know, so it is actually quite, you know, so what is the story behind it? And why did this 6-year-old kid get it into her head that, you know, for that contrast and for that story alone, it was worth preserving?
Wow. And that is the value
and
of
that's
something
the value. And so now it's not there.
absence. Oh, what a great story. Elizabeth, I've got goosebumps. But thank you so much for being on the show. We've run out of time. Well, thank you for sharing some of your experiences and your stories with us, bringing this whole new perspective to the show. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
That's all we have for you on this episode of The Future is Female. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.